This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for this 481st edition of MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. That's what most videos do in this series anyway. Sometimes I'd like to look at the other end of the spectrum and give my picks for the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst life gain cards ever. In the next MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at the best life gain cards, so we're going to have back-to-back episodes where we take a look at life gain. Gaining life can be a pretty useful thing in Magic. It helps you stabilize against an aggressive opponent early, and it gives you more time to pursue your game plan. It's even useful in aggro decks because against other aggro decks you can really alter the race with life gain. However, there are a lot of bad life gain cards out there. This is because most cards that don't do much other than gain you life are pretty bad. You have to gain a ton of life for a very efficient cost for a pure life gain card to be worth it, and none of the cards on this list even approach that level of efficiency. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be able to gain you life. As usual with worst lists, this video isn't based on my opinion, but my selections are informed by a bit of data. A card can't be widely played in EDH, nor can it have ever been successful in competitive Magic, and be on this list. After all, if either of those things are true, the card really can't be considered bad. This list is really bad, even compared to other worst top 10s. Two famously bad life gain cards, Healing Salve and Archangel's Light, didn't even get close to making the list. In comparison to what we're going to see here, those cards look pretty awesome. Before we get into the list, I do want to take a moment to talk about this video's special sponsor, Into the AM. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know they've sponsored a lot of videos in the past, and now they're back. Into the AM is a great apparel company with really unique graphic shirt designs like the one I'm wearing now. If you know me, you know I love birds, so I really love that one of their recurring motifs is an owl. This shirt is called Nocturnal, and it features what appears to be a gigantic owl looming over a forest. One other great thing about Into the AM is that their shirts actually fit me. That might sound like a small thing, but I'm 6'3" and 260 pounds, and I usually need big and tall shirts, but Into the AM's XXL shirts fit me, and I'm pretty happy about that. So if all of that stuff sounds good to you, check out the description where you can find a direct link to their store. Alright, now it's time for my picks for the 10 worst life gain cards we've ever seen. At number 10, I've got Merchant Ship. This is the only creature on this list, and that's because if a card can actually add to the board, it isn't nearly as bad as cards that don't do anything to the board. That said, Merchant Ship only very slightly adds something to the board. It's a 1-mana 0/2 that can only attack the opponent if they control an island. With 0 power, it obviously doesn't damage the opponent at all when it attacks. Instead, you get to gain a whole 2 life if it doesn't get blocked, so yeah, this 1-mana 0/2 is mostly going to be blocking and not very well, and that's pretty much all it can accomplish. It's pretty wild that it's such an irrelevant creature even before you realize it can't attack unless your opponent has an island. I haven't even mentioned that if you don't have an island yourself, it has to be sacrificed, but to be fair, that downside isn't a huge one since you're using blue mana to cast it anyway, but hey, it's yet another downside on what is already an awful card, but at least it can block stuff. That's more than I can say for other cards on this list. At number 9, I have Bargain. This card doesn't do anything but gain you life. 3 mana and a card for 7 life isn't a very good exchange rate. But Bargain gets a whole lot worse, since it also lets an opponent draw a card. I initially had Bargain a lot higher up on this list, but of all the cards on the list, it's played the most in EDH by far, and that's because it can at least do some fun political stuff. Like, you can give someone you're allied with the card, in which case it doesn't hurt you quite as much. So while the card is still awful, it does have some interesting uses in multiplayer games, and that keeps it at number 9 on this list. At number 8, I have Spiritual Sanctuary. This 4-mana enchantment gains you 1 life every upkeep if you control a plains. While this does give you a repeatable source of life gain which can trigger life gain payoffs and the like, it's just so inefficient at gaining you that life. It takes a pretty long time before you feel like you've gotten a full card worth of value out of this. You basically have to have a board filled with life gain payoffs for this to work out for you, and even then there are literally hundreds of better life gain cards you could be using. You also have to wait a full turn before the first time you gain life, so using 4 mana for this enchantment that doesn't do anything to the board is a problem. That's why only 13 decks on EDHREC out of almost 600,000 are using this card. This also has the additional downside of letting your opponent gain life if they control a plains on their upkeep, as if it wasn't already a bad card. At number 7, it is Elixir of Vitality. The best Elixir of Vitality can do is gain you 4 life for 4 mana, and you can't even get that life right away. You have to wait a whole turn, since it enters the battlefield tapped. It does have the additional upside that if you have a ton of mana, you can pump 8 into it to gain 8 life, but you're still paying way too much for that, especially because you have to wait a whole turn to get that life in the first place. At number 7, it is Farmstead. This is an aura that you put on a land, and once it's there, you get the option of paying 2 white mana every upkeep to gain 1 life. It also happens to cost 3 white mana, limiting the decks that even want to look at a card like this. But yeah, you're basically never going to get your full value back on a card like this. Sure, it's another card where you can get repeatable life gain triggers, but it takes far too much effort to get them. Farmstead isn't mana efficient, and it also isn't worth a card. At number 5, I have the original Lucky Charm cycle from Alpha. They kind of stand in for any artifact cycle that gains you life when a spell of a particular color is cast. Those cycles are pretty much all bad, but I do think this is the worst of them. So, these effects are really narrow, and only useful as sideboard cards for the most part. You can gain life off of your own spells, of course, but that isn't going to be enough, so you really need your opponent to be casting spells that gain you life too. And what makes this cycle truly terrible compared to the others is that you also have to have 1 mana up for each spell to gain the life in the first place. So they're already narrow, and then they ask you to pump additional mana into them to gain a meager amount of life. At least the cards in other cycles like this gain you life without you having to do anything, and that's certainly how it should be with a narrow effect like this. At number 4, it is Convalescence, another very narrow life gain card, and one that doesn't really pay you off for just how narrow it is. This 2 mana enchantment gains you 1 life every upkeep, but only if you have 10 or less life. If you're interested in gaining life, it is often because you need to have a deck that is capable of stabilizing against aggro decks, and this just won't do the job. If your life is at 10 or less and the best you can do is gain 1 life with this thing, you're probably in trouble. Any aggro deck worth its salt is going to be able to overpower something gaining you only 1 life a turn, and this doesn't even gain you life if your life is above 10, so either it isn't doing anything, or it gives you a tiny bit of life that won't make a real difference. At number 3, I have Living Artifact. For 1 mana, you get an aura with Enchant Artifact. Then, once it's on that artifact, Living Artifact gains a Vitality counter for every single damage you take. Then, on each upkeep, you can remove one of those counters from Living Artifact to gain 1 life. And you can only do it that 1 time per turn, and only during your upkeep, so, yeah. This might only cost a single mana, but it's still not delivering on that investment at all. To gain life with it, a few things have to line up. First, you have to have an artifact to put this on, then your opponent has to damage you. So, what's the payoff when those 2 things add up? Well, you can gain 1 life on your upkeep. We just talked about how 1 life at a time isn't going to get the job done, and that's certainly the case with Living Artifact too. At number 2, I've got Juju Bubble. This is a pretty famously bad card, and deservedly so. For 1 mana, you get an artifact that you can pay 2 mana for to gain 1 life. Now, if that's all this card did, it would actually be pretty intriguing. It doesn't gain you life efficiently, of course, but it is a repeatable source of life gain you can pump a whole bunch of mana into. But the problem is that this comes with 2 massive downsides, and those 2 downsides make each other even worse. First, it has cumulative upkeep, which means you have to pay mana every upkeep to keep it around, and that mana is cumulative. In other words, you pay 1 mana on the first upkeep, 2 mana on the second upkeep, and so forth. So, yeah, you aren't going to have as much mana as you would like to pump into the bubble, and that's even more true because the second downside makes you sacrifice it if you play any card at all. So, that means you can't play more lands to gain more life with it. If you can generate infinite mana with this and play, I guess you can gain 1 billion life with this, but you really only have that 1 turn to pull it off, and that's way too narrow. Especially because it's terrible in all situations that don't involve infinite mana, and if a card is only good when you have infinite mana, well, it's not very good. I mean, there's a whole lot of cards out there that if you can set up an infinite mana combo, would be far more effective at winning you the game, even in situations where you don't have infinite mana. And at number 1, I've got Fasting. We've seen a lot of cards that don't do enough to make up the card you use by casting them in the first place on this list, but Fasting is even worse than all of those because not only does it not give you enough value up front, it also makes you give up additional cards to do anything. Every upkeep you can choose to skip your draw step to gain 2 life. There are occasionally situations where that can be sort of useful, like against a mill deck or something, but other than that, you basically never want to forfeit drawing a card to gain only 2 life. What's worse is it doesn't even stick around forever. You only get 5 upkeeps with it, so if you really did need a repeatable source of life gain and you didn't want to draw cards, you don't even get to keep it around forever. So yeah, Fasting is the worst life gain card ever and one of the worst Magic cards to ever see cardboard. So those are my picks for the 10 worst life gain cards ever. If you're interested in buying any of these cards because, I don't know, you want to see if your shredder can handle card stock, you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them in the description. If you enjoy this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of MTG Top 10, including one on the best life gain cards coming in the very near future, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the past MTG Top 10s, and there's almost 500 of them at this point, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon or with a YouTube membership. Thanks for watching.